We are Daily News. You can support us with the super thanks button below. Ukraine's brave and powerful ally, Turkey, continues to strive with all its means to end the war in Eastern Europe. Turkey, which has constantly supported Kiev against the threats of Russia both in Ukraine and in the Black Sea, has provided significant military aid to the Ukrainian army, and this aid is still continuing against the dangers of the Russian Navy in the Black Sea. The Turkish government landed the TCG Anadolu amphibious aircraft carrier in cool waters ready for duty. The Turkish aircraft carrier in the Black Sea is 3 football fields in size and has striking features such as suitable areas for armed UAVs and a runway compatible with fighter jets. Turkey, in addition to its latest efforts to prevent the Russian threat in the Black Sea, has taken another striking step to assist the Ukrainian armed forces in ground operations. More than 30 Turkish-made COBRA 2 4x4 armored vehicles were seen being transported by train from the Romanian city of Bacău to the city of Suceava, close to the Ukrainian border. These striking images revealed that Turkey is a true ally of Ukraine, as well as its mediation role. The support Romania provided in logistics was due to the fact that it's a country on the Black Sea coast. On the other hand, it is not clear at the moment whether the Turkish COBRA vehicles departing from Bacău have reached Cucurova. However, these vehicles are expected to appear on Ukrainian soil at least in the coming days. The COBRA is known for good ballistic protection as well as adaptability of the same platform to different missions. Since it is designed on the same body and infrastructure, and many models and types can be produced, it provides great convenience in maintenance and service, even in different Turkish COBRAs produced for different purposes. The fact that the main structure remains the same and it provides great savings in maintenance, repair and spare parts makes the COBRA an armored vehicle preferred by many armies. There is also an amphibious version of the 4x4 COBRA armored vehicle with rubber tires which can carry 9 personnel. These vehicles were first used on the battlefield in the South Ossetian War. Now it's on its way to Ukraine. If you remember, before the COBRA vehicles, Turkey brought KRP armored vehicles into Ukraine from the Bakhmut highway. Turkish hedgehogs drastically changed the Bakhmut clashes. Now there will be both hedgehogs and COBRA armored vehicles on the battlefield. In other words, Russia's situation on the front will become very difficult. Meanwhile, Turkey's extraordinary policy towards the Ukraine war astonished the whole world. Many war analysts did not anticipate that COBRAs would be sent to the Ukrainian army. In fact, Erdogan, who developed military cooperation with Kiev and rejected Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, continued this policy even after Russia invaded Ukraine. So this situation was somewhat predictable. During the Battle of Kiev, the Bayraktar Tb2 was supplied by Turkey to Ukraine, had succeeded in destroying Russian air defense systems, command centers and supply convoys. The Tb2 also targeted the Russian deployment on Snake Island off Odessa and reportedly played a role in the sinking of Moskva, the flagship of Russia's Black Sea Fleet. The Ukrainians were so happy that they even dedicated a song to Turkish drones. But Turkey's help angered Russian President Vladimir Putin. Shortly before the invasion began, 2 Turkish military cargo planes allegedly carrying drones into Ukraine were stranded there for 10 months until Russia assured them that they would return home safely. However, Turkey reportedly continued arms shipments to Ukraine via Poland. According to the open-source intelligence site Oryx, since March, Turkey has supplied Ukraine with at least 35 Bayraktar Tb2 S-24 Bayraktar mini unmanned aerial vehicles, a large number of guided rocket launchers, armored vehicles, mortars, electronic warfare equipment and ammunition. Located in the strategic area between Europe and Asia, Turkey has become a game-changing power in both the Baltic region and Eastern Europe. Turkey's surprise move for Finland, which is in the most critical position for the alliance. These days changed the fundamental balances in NATO. Turkey finally approved the membership offer of Helsinki and the accession process came to an end. Finland's accession became official when Foreign Minister Pekka Haavisto signed the accession documents and handed them over to her U.S. counterpart, Antony Blinken. After all this, the foreign ministers of NATO countries met at the headquarters in Brussels, where a ceremony was held for Finland's admission to NATO membership. Finland became the 31st member of NATO and the first country to join in 3 years after the Turkish parliament accepted its application. The previous country was North Macedonia, which joined in 2020. In short, Finland's joining NATO with Turkey's approval has primarily isolated Russia in the diplomatic arena rather than broader security or the war in Ukraine. If Sweden joins the NATO alliance with Turkey's surprise approval decision, far more difficult days will await Russia. In the meantime, Ankara's Moscow policy under Erdogan has been a critical global policy in conflict, including Syria and Libya. With the outbreak of the Ukraine war, relations between Erdogan and Putin began to reach much more strategic dimensions. In order to dissuade Russia from this war, Erdogan was establishing sensitive relations with Moscow leader Vladimir Putin while continuing to provide assistance to Ukraine. As we mentioned, Erdogan's balancing act got him talking to both Putin and Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky. Turkey brought the two warring sides together twice in March, but to no avail. Erdogan has had at least 18 phone calls and 4 face-to-face meetings with Putin since February 23. In July, Turkey and the United Nations brokered an agreement that paved the way for Ukraine's grain exports currently within the efforts of Turkey. The grain agreement has been extended for another 120 days at the latest. In addition, Erdogan, Zelensky, and UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres met in Lviv to discuss the expansion of the agreement and the security of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in southern Ukraine. On the other hand, Turkey hosted a meeting between the US and Russian intelligence chiefs and talks between Russian and US diplomats. Erdogan's mediation efforts have so far failed to bring the warring parties to the table. But the West has not given up on a NATO ally that can talk to Putin. Erdogan also won high praise from the West for mediating the grain deal and a subsequent prisoner exchange. A few more points seem worth mentioning regarding the gains and limitations of Erdogan's maneuvers. First, Russia's preoccupation with Ukraine serves Turkey's efforts to increase its influence in the Caucasus and Central Asia. However, this does not mean that Russia has lost ground in its backyard and that Turkey no longer has to stay there. Second, the increasing flow of Azerbaijani gas to Europe via Turkey increases Turkey's value for the West. But amid Europe's efforts to abandon Russian gas, Putin has managed to stir things up by proposing to set up a regional gas hub in Turkey. Although the merits of the proposal remain unclear, Erdogan initially welcomed it. In fact, it was a normal approach for Turkey to positively respond to its access to Russian gas at a critical time because Turkey was an exemplary country to the world in producing balanced policies. Yes, complex relations affected Turkey's roles, but the Turkish government was among the parties that supported Ukraine's independence and demanded that Russia stop the invasion. But whatever happens, given all this aid, Turkey will remain a brave ally of Ukraine. The Ukrainian army is coming with thunder for Crimea. With the end of the winter months, the Ukrainian army begins to implement its plans for the Crimean offensive. After the Ukrainian authorities announced that the Crimean offensive was imminent, great activity began in the Ukrainian army. Crimea is no longer a distant destination for Ukraine. We witness airstrikes and sabotage almost every day at Russian military bases and positions in Crimea. This is described as the footsteps of the Ukrainians. The Ukrainian army largely formed the infrastructure for the Crimean offensive. In order for the offensive to begin, the training of the Crimean assault brigades will have to be completed. The Western tanks will have to reach a sufficient level, and the suitable weather conditions will have to be established. Until now, Ukrainian forces have always smelled the right moment at the front for Crimea. this feeling would be even more sensitive. Let's examine together the preparations for the offensive of the Ukrainian army with an army of over 100,000 troops and the scenarios that can be experienced in the Crimea. A Ukrainian official said his country is preparing assault brigades to retake occupied territory, including parts of the eastern Donbass region and the Black Sea Peninsula, Crimea, which Russia legally annexed in 2014. The announcement came from National Police Chief Fyodor Klimenko, who was appointed the country's acting interior minister after government officials were killed in a helicopter crash on a foggy morning in a Kiev suburb. In a press release, Klimenko said that Ukraine has set up assault brigades, which will consist of police and border guards and Ukraine's most elite troops, which will have the purpose of liberating our lands. These are the people who went through the 2014-2015 crucible, some of whom fought in 2022. Some are injured. The units will be made entirely of volunteers driven by a sense of patriotism. And there are many such people in Ukraine. There are currently around 50,000 troops in the Crimean offensive brigades. 10,000 of these are very specially trained units. There are also at least 40,000 Ukrainian troops currently besieging Melitopol and Zaporizhia. These units are likely to lead the Crimean offensive in the most likely scenario. We will see an army of at least 100,000 troops for Ukraine's Crimean operation. This is necessary, but may not even be sufficient because the Russian army has about 50,000 troops in Crimea. The attacking side must have at least 2 to 3 times more troops than the defender. According to NATO analysts, both Ukraine and Russia have a critical 6 months ahead of them. Ukraine's allies provide Ukraine with everything needed for a successful counter operation, such as training, equipment, logistics, and intelligence. Experts expect Ukrainian offensives to take place in the spring or summer. Russia has also started its preparations in this direction. Russia rightly expects the Ukrainian offensive to come from the Luhansk and Zaporozhye regions. The target of these attacks of the Ukrainian army is undoubtedly to sever the land connection between Crimea and Russia. So could this be a scam? Of course it can. As you may recall, before the Ukrainian offensives began last summer, Russian officials thought that the offensive would start from Kherson, but the Ukrainian army attacked Kharkiv instead of Kherson and liberated most of the territory under Russian army control. Now, a similar scenario could happen for the Crimea. The Russians can wait for the Ukrainian army to attack the Crimea via Kherson and neglect its defenses in Luhansk and Zaporizhia. This will undoubtedly be a disaster for the Russian army and relieve the Ukrainian army's efforts to liberate Crimea. All the weapons promised by the Western states gradually began to enter the Ukrainian army inventory. Leopard 2 tanks and the first batch of Challenger 2s arrived in Ukraine. Apart from that, HIMARS has been deployed to the Kherson region, and Ukrainian soldiers trained in countries such as the USA and UK are on standby. Ukraine, with such a power, an operation to the Crimea can take place. After all, they have the right to seize all the lands they've lost. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said that the withdrawal of Russian troops from all regions, including Crimea, is essential for the war to end. He promised to retake the peninsula, saying that the Ukrainian army has maintained its goal of liberating Crimea since it was annexed. The decision to form assault brigades was taken by the Ukrainian authorities, who were furious enough to defeat the Russian army. Most of the soldiers defending Ukraine took the initiative to recruit people into such troops. Therefore, it was decided to unite in such brigades all those who are willing, patriotic, who have lost their home or relatives due to the war. The formation of troops aimed at liberating Ukraine and reaching internationally recognized borders has already begun. Crimea, which was captured by Russian President Vladimir Putin 9 years ago after phony referendums that were labeled illegitimate by the international community, is internationally recognized. as Ukrainian territory annexed by the Russian Federation. There are fears that retaking Crimea would be a red line for Russia and that Putin could use his country's nuclear capabilities to defend the region. The pro-Russian Crimean Civil Assembly said it believed that if any attempt was made to return Crimea to Ukrainian control, a global nuclear war would break out immediately and that Russia would not forgive it. Meanwhile, Ukrainian intelligence officials said that the Ukrainian army must do everything to ensure that Crimea returns home by the summer. Last fall, Russia announced that it had annexed the partially occupied regions of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia through illegal referendums. Russia does not have full control of any of the territories, and foreign governments, including the United States, have called the move illegitimate. Well, what awaits us after the Ukrainian offensives begin? The next 6 months will witness a great human tragedy. The Ukrainian armed forces will face difficult war conditions and Ukrainian civilians will continue to endure daily Russian attacks. Meanwhile, Russia's poorly equipped and ill-managed troops will suffer thousands of casualties, destroying the country's remaining fighting capability. According to the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Russian military has already suffered more than 150,000 deaths and injuries, and thousands more will die this spring due to the Kremlin's callous disregard for human life, thanks to the negligence of the regime of President Vladimir Putin. With the help of the newly promised Western tanks and other weapons, the Ukrainian armed forces will liberate more areas in the east and south of the country, which will make it possible to imagine a final Ukrainian operation to retake Crimea. The peninsula, which was illegally annexed by Putin in 2014, served as a staging area for Russia's war with Ukraine, which began in February 2022. Now that Crimea is under Russian control, it allows the Russian army to threaten Ukrainian positions from the south and provides a forward base for Russia to launch long-range attacks on the Black Sea Fleet. But for the first 9 months of the war, Kyiv's Western supporters were reluctant to support any military effort to return the region to Ukraine. For most of the past year, while the idea of liberating Crimea remained academic, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky was willing to put aside the question of the region's near-term status. Ukrainian forces were focused on liberating the occupied territories outside the peninsula, and the future of Crimea seemed to be determined by diplomatic negotiations after the war's end. But as the war progressed and Ukraine liberated much of its territory from Russian forces, Zelensky's rhetoric about Crimea changed. Crimea is Ukrainian territory. As long as the West continues to supply Ukraine with its weapons, the Ukrainian army will take back what is its own. According to U.S. officials, the Biden administration began to come to the conclusion that Ukraine may need to threaten Russia's presence on the peninsula to strengthen its negotiating position despite the risk of escalating the conflict. If serious negotiations were to begin soon, Zelensky might still be open to an agreement that would end the war and postpone the Crimean question until a later date. But if the conflict continues throughout the spring and summer and Ukraine liberates important lands and inflicts huge losses on Russia, it will become increasingly difficult for Zelensky to allow Putin a salvage exit and allow Russia an ongoing but temporary occupation of Crimea. By the summer, it looks like Ukraine will begin targeting more of Russia's military infrastructure in Crimea in preparation for a broader campaign to liberate the peninsula. Doing so will put Putin at the negotiating table and create an opening for diplomatic talks, giving Putin a way out of Ukraine while the final status of Crimea remains uncertain. This will not guarantee Putin's political demise and will allow Ukraine to avoid a massively costly military action. This is by no means guaranteed to be successful. The final agreement will require the immediate reduction of Russian conventional forces on the peninsula and chart the path to a referendum that will allow the people of Crimea, including those displaced after the 2014 offensive, to determine the final status of the region. The Biden administration should help Ukraine end the war quickly and definitively rather than let the conflict continue. Doing so could save both Ukraine and Russia from a new war year. tragedy by allowing the final status of Crimea to be determined by negotiation rather than force. It would also secure Ukrainian democracy, discourage authoritarian powers from considering military aggression in the future, and reduce the risk of a nuclear escalation that could escalate into an existential conflict. The rapidly deteriorating weather precipitated a shift in a focus on urban fighting. The increased intensity of clashes inside the city allowed Russians to secure more gains and start establishing control over tactically significant positions such as factories and high-rise buildings. However, in order to not allow Russians to reap the benefits of these positions, Ukrainians started using various methods of wiping them out together with the Russians. Last time I told you that Ukrainians and Russians in Bakhmut faced the biggest snowfall of the decade that completely covered the ground and trenches and made the infantry fights impossible. However, urban fights are much less affected by such weather conditions, although during the snowfall, the intensity of attacks did slow down because both parties could not use drones and artillery. The freshest reports suggest that once the sky became clear, the clashes inside the city rapidly resumed in the southern part of the region. The Ukrainian 93rd Mechanized Brigade showed how they continue to destroy enemy forces' concentrations. Since everything is covered in snow, spotting manpower in the streets with thermal cameras became much easier, which works more against Russians as they have to get out of cover and assault Ukrainian positions. After the whole squad entered the house, Ukrainians started shelling it with artillery. Since Russians started applying a lot of pressure from the west in an attempt to reach the stadium, Ukrainians started narrowing down the cauldron. But before withdrawing, Ukrainians also made sure to leave some surprises. It seems like instead of using standard booby traps, Ukrainians are waiting until the Russians enter the house and then manually blow up the whole building. Recent combat footage shows how Ukrainians are operating on the outskirts. They pull the cord from the house across the street during the withdrawal and then manually detonated the explosives from a distance. But the 93rd Mechanized Brigade loved the biggest surprise for Russians on Mariupol Street. Here, Russians have been fighting for weeks to establish control over the tallest building in the region. When Ukrainians realized that they needed to step back to the other side of the street, they mined the whole building. A recently released for the old footage reveals that the moment Russians assumed this tactically significant positions, Ukrainians completely destroyed it. When it comes to the central part of the region, Russians continue to have the initiative. Today it was reported that they managed to secure the second half of the block near the embankment. With the shrinking control over the river bank, it becomes harder and harder to hold the rest of the positions along the river, which is why it is expected that in the next few days Ukrainians will step back towards the main street. Russians are trying to suppress Ukrainian fire and penetrate the defenses deeper. With the drop in temperatures doing it became easier because of the more visible contrast on thermal cameras. However, due to the density of high-rise buildings, gaining control over each street takes a lot of manpower. Yes, today, Russian war correspondent Alexander Karchenko said that there is so much death here that Russian forces operating in Bakhmut have become apathetic to the deaths of their comrades. He said that very often soldiers use the line on the ground corpses as markers when giving each other directions. In the northern part of the region, Ukrainians seem to have gained even more ground. As you remember, several weeks ago, Russians penetrated Ukrainian defenses here and gained control over 2 streets. 2 days ago, I told you that Ukrainians recaptured 1 street because the fights reportedly took place near the stadium. And today, Ukrainians blew up the bridge right behind them. Some sources say that Russians were not pushed out and the Ukrainians cut them off from the south, while other sources said that such operation would be too risky to conduct without gaining total control over the last street. Today, Ukrainians also released footage of a precision strike on the occupied territory of the ASM industrial complex. The strike was conducted with the Soviet tactical ballistic missile Tb2. It seems like this was not the only strike, because in the video one operator said to prepare for the second one. Overall, despite the fact that the weather temporarily made infantry fights impossible in the fields, Ukrainians and Russians still engaged in heavy fights inside the city, as Russians started moving into the areas with big buildings that, unlike small houses on the outskirts, could be used as powerful firing points, storage for ammunition, and in some cases, even equipment. Ukrainians started resorting to more drastic measures, such as blowing up the buildings, bridges, and even hitting Russians with the scarce ballistic missiles. Such measures are very effective and do not allow Russians to secure powerful positions to minimize their losses. What do you think about this? As Daily News team, we will continue to closely follow the developments in Russia and bring you the latest news. Our team spends a great deal of effort to prepare these news. You can support our team for the development of independent journalism. For this, you can use the Super Thanks button below the video. We also carefully read your comments on our news. We would like to know what you think about this incident. What do you think was the purpose of this attack? What do you think about the explosions in Russia, and how do you think this will affect the course of the war? Share your thoughts with us. Follow us for more updates.